Well, look at that. When you ban someone, it automatically removes all of their emojis they've used. So, yay. I mean, we'll go through. I've got, we're not, are we, maybe we should just start. We've got a bunch of people in here already. We'll go ahead and jump in. So, first off, as always, thank all of you guys for joining us. We are very excited to have you here. Last 7 days of my life have been hilariously stressful, so I'm glad there's a lot of people here who can help pick up some of the slack, because my brain is probably not going to be even as minorly useful as it is normally. A couple things of housekeeping before we dive in. As always, we're going to request anyone who has a desire to help us volunteer, take care of things, moderate, run a chat, be in a chat, anything you want to do, feel free to hit us up in the volunteer channel. We're really excited to sort of start a whole bunch of new chats. On that note, this week we are going to be doing our best to start up Cinema 1 and 2. I know we had a few people excited about starting that up. I won't be able to host it every week. This one takes a lot of my time, but I'm definitely going to be able to be involved. So please hit up the volunteer chat if you want to help run one of those, or have any other chats that you want to, talks, readings, anything else. And we are a few days behind on all of our recordings. I'm going to be getting those up probably later tonight, tomorrow at the latest. With that, any other notes on any of the other talks? I know we've Jack, Will, Varun, Muskie, Kent.
I'm late on the first Butler recording. There was an audio issue, but I'm dealing with it. So I know I got a few DMs and a few mentions for like the recording of the first Judith Butler meeting. That's on me. I apologize. It should be done today.
I can't believe I missed Judith Butler.
That's okay.
I'll survive. I definitely want to join the next one. Anything else? Kent, I know we had a bunch of stuff going on in your world. Anything big?
Yes, there's the the Zizek reading of Looking Awry that's on the last couple of chapters. And then there's the Heidegger Basic Works, where we're going to read What is Metaphysics this week.
Awesome.
And just for the last side of the week, literature is currently trying to choose its next test. Last I looked, Heraclitus's Fragments was winning, but it's still kind of early after recovering from some technical difficulties. And then finally, Simondon will be meeting on Sunday at 11 a.m. PDT to continue their discussion on technical objects. And Quarantine Literature will be meeting Saturday at 12 p.m. PDT to go over whatever text we do choose.
So today's chat and reading is on Chapter 3, Section 4, Psychoanalysis and Ethnology, inside of Anti-Oedipus. It's going to be a fun one, because anytime Deleuze and Guattari start off a chapter by saying we are moving too fast, you know very damn well they're not going to be slowing down. So it's a whole thing. As always, join us in the discussion chat live. Type away. Ask any notes if you have commentary. In between every paragraph, we will be taking all kinds of questions and all kinds of thoughts. Please join us. We're really excited. So with that, I guess I'll go ahead and just dive into psychoanalysis and ethnology. We are moving too fast, acting as if Oedipus were already installed within the savage territorial machine. However, as Nietzsche says with regard to bad conscience, such a plant does not grow on that kind of terrain. This is explained by the fact that the necessary conditions for Oedipus, as a familial complex, exist in the framework of the familialism suited to psychiatry and psychoanalysis, are obviously not present. Primitive families constitute a praxis, a politics, a strategy of alliances and filiations. Formally, they are the driving elements of social reproduction. They have nothing to do with an expressive microcosm. In these families, the father, the mother, and the sister always function as something other than father, mother, or sister. And in addition to the father, the mother, etc., there is the affine, who constitutes the active, concrete reality and makes the relations between families coextensive with the social field. It would not even be exact to say that the family determinations burst apart at every corner of this field and remain attached to strictly social determinations, since both kinds of determinations form one and the same component in the territorial machine. Since familial reproduction is not yet a simple means, or a material at the service of a social reproduction of another nature, there is no possibility of reducing, rabattre social reproduction to familial reproduction, nor is it possible to establish one-to-one relations between the two that would confer on any familial complex whatever an expressive value and an apparent autonomous form. On the contrary, it is evident that the individual in the family, however young, directly invests a social, historical, economic, and political field that is not reducible to any mental structure or affective constellation. That is why, when one considers pathological cases and processes of cure in primitive societies, it seems to us entirely insufficient to compare them with psychoanalytic procedure by relating them to criteria borrowed from the latter. For example, a familial complex, even if it differs from our own, or cultural material, even if it is brought into relation with an ethnic unconscious, as seen in attempted parallelisms between the psychoanalytic cure and the shamanistic cure, Devereux and Levi Strauss. Our definition of schizoanalysis focused on two aspects: the destruction of the expressive pseudo-forms of the unconscious and the discovery of desire's unconscious investments of the social field. It is from this point of view that we must consider many primitive cures. They are schizoanalysis in action. I'm not going to say anything because I'm just confused. Anyone feel free to jump in.
So I think at least my interpretation with regards to what they're saying about the mother and the father, I think they're talking about the illegitimate use, where I think there's a so I think the correct use would be the intensive sort of with regards to understanding through naming, right? And so I think if you I think they're talking about that incorrect use of the third synthesis, right? Where you would the third paralogism, where you would extract a global person or somebody that is rather than an intensive relationship. But I think with regards to the entire thing of this paragraph, it's regards to, I mean, I think desiring production is desiring production in many ways is the limit of basically the social forces that hold it together. So social production or the socius, that they come into being through, when desiring production organizes itself into mass social wholes, right? There's in a society, you don't just have one per people, you have like many people, and I think it's from those relationships that you essentially get different forms of repression, and the social production in a way is supposed to hold on to desiring production. It's supposed to sort of keep that limit, and if the limit sort of breaks, then you get the whole decoded flow and stuff.
So I think it's worth just for a moment reading just a little bit of Holland, which I think helps me. It helped eliminate a little bit of this chapter for me. The line at Eugene Holland's Deleuze and Guattari's Anti-Oedipus, Introduction to Schizoanalysis. We have a PDF in Outbound Files. Finally, anti-production is the organization of matter and energy flows on the socius, provides a crucial corrective to what Deleuze and Guattari call the exchangeism of Levi Strauss. In fact, the concept of the socius provides a materialist basis for what Levi Strauss called the symbolic order. That is, for the codes and the systems of inscription that organize desire socially in the different modes of social production. Just skipping ahead. For Deleuze and Guattari, by contrast, Chapter 3 of Anti-Oedipus is meant to show social organization is not everywhere the same. Forms of coding and systems of inscription differ significantly among three ideal type modes of social production they analyze, in part because desire gets organized or inscribed on the type of socius specific to each mode of social production. And right now we're talking deeply about that first mode, the earth, before we get into the despot and capital.
Yeah, I think a good example of coding, at least, I mean, at least before capitalism relies on coding in the sense that coding is axiomatizing. And before, I mean, right now we're in primitive societies. So with regard to this form of coding, I think it's in terms of quantitative and qualitative factors or attributes, and so I mean the example that I think if I remember correctly, Holland gives this too, but the example is that of a married bachelor and an unmarried bachelor, right? So if you remember from all the way back from chapter 1, the body without organs is produced, but it doesn't do any actual producing. It's just that surface that, as they say in section 5, it does the practical question. It almost works as a sort of organization center of asking where to cut the flow, where to break the flow. And, I think one example of this could be like, as Holland gives out, is the example of the married man. So when a man is married, he's coded in a certain way that his code is that of a married man. So the flows or the breaks or flows that he interrupts will be very different from the breaks or flows that the bachelor, who is coded as a bachelor, interrupts, right? So in such a sense, coding has to do with this sort of system of semiotics or meaning that implies that works above to imply or allow restrictions or disavow restrictions as well. And so it goes back, and I think one way to visualize the body without organs, or at least the body without organs in terms of the socius, is with regards to the socius as the collective body without organs, right? It is the same thing, right? They say desire and production and social production is the same flow of desire, but it's separated by regime.
Well, so really quick, because I want to just dive in because I think this is a very specific point. My understanding was, as I read this, that the socius during these sort of the first two phases, we'll say there are these three phases, the last one being capital. During the first two, the body without organs and the socius are almost intrinsically linked. They're the same thing, whereas with capital, due to the way things are overcoded and the organization of society, the body without organs actually becomes separated from the socius and becomes its own thing, able to act and be inscribed upon itself.
Yeah, but I mean, with regards to functioning, I think in terms of functioning, in terms of attraction and repulsing, the fact that it's produced in terms of when desire and production produces anti-production, right? Desire and production somehow produces anti-production, which leads to a disjunction, and disjunction leads to that used example of schizophrenic table, right? Where the machines need to detach for the product identity of the table to come into existence, essentially. But then with regards to the body without organs then functions as either attracting or repulsing. And I in the same way, the socius does the exact same thing, right? It codes stuff, and so it has the opportunity to essentially code and decode in terms of attraction and repulsion. And that's why I think it's safe to assume that they are talking about sort of like a collective body without organs, or maybe even everyone's body without organs all combined together to form one massive body with organs. But I think the key thing here is that this is in terms of social formations, and I think Frogtown also brought this point up with regards to. With regards to what they're talking about in terms of social production, is that in terms of it sort of works in a way that I think it's almost like a Nietzschean thesis, right? That they don't see man as a social individual. I think in a way, and in terms of understanding the social individual, they say that social formations almost in a specific way might actually be repressive, and they're talking about how these when social formations form together, they work to sort of blockade that limit of desire and production or keep it in check.
Well, so and when they're talking about savagery and they're talking about that sort of first primitive worldview, the way that everything functions as Holland describes it, the need for these codings and the symbolism is excessively deep because everything is very much run by it. But as he puts it, because there is no economics as we know it today, savagery is also the social form most harshly governed by codes of conduct, belief, and meaning, necessarily so, because that's how you're able to stop overcoding. That's how you're able to stop excess. He brings up the idea of how they have ritual sacrifices, they have feasts, they have orgies, they have all kinds of stuff under the original setup that really stops that sort of excessive economics of the whole thing. And so savagery is the one most harshly formed and where these things are most sort of built up.
Yeah, exactly. There's a really great, I think, with regards to coding and stuff, the economics of orgies. But there's a really great lecture. I think someone linked it here before. But this is like, so the Purdue University actually has been sequentially for the last couple months or maybe years have been translating all these Deleuze lectures. Like they have like 17 lectures on his book on Leibniz in the fold, and they have I think they just had like last night or something, they just added lectures on the War Machine from 1,000 Plateaus, and they have one Anti-Oedipus lecture which is all about codes, which is Deleuze is being very clear in that lecture when he's saying that in terms of once we reach capitalism, the nightmare of all societies is the decoded flow. And what these primitive societies, he sees in these primitive societies in the sense is that these primitive societies had to create all these rituals or systems of meaning. And I mean, we have to also be careful in terms of meaning here, right? Because they're not doing like hermeneutic analysis. They're saying that meaning is meaning in terms of function rather than meaning in terms of, some Lacanian sort of triad. But with regards to, I think what they say with these rituals, it's sort of, I think in a way it's sort of to keep to not reach the limit, right? And it goes back to social formations, and social formations sort of restrict that limit from reaching a desire in production, and that's why we have those rituals. But I think in terms of capitalism, everything is almost deterritorialized, and you reach like decoded flows and stuff, and these limits sort of break down in terms of the excess.
Well, it's the word Holland really likes to use is axiomatization, which is a terrible fucking word, but also a great one for it, where everything becomes so qualitative. Oh, it's a very different beast. I do want to make sure we do keep moving on, but I want to talk about the last part of this paragraph, where it talks about our definition of schizoanalysis focused on two aspects: the destruction of the expressive pseudo forms of the unconscious and the discovery of desire's unconscious investments in the social field. It is from this point of view we must consider many primitive cures. They are schizoanalysis in action. It's very much what this section, I believe, is about. Is looking back and deciding what worked, how things are set up, and how things were set up amongst, as they refer to it, savage times, and utilizing sort of that understanding of how desire flows once worked as a cure, as they say, for capital. Is that close? Because it's the lens I ended up reading the rest of the section through, and if it's not the case, I've got a problem.
Yeah, I don't know if in this paragraph, I don't think they're hinting at a cure just yet. I think what they're getting at is like the way these. So like we talked previously about how structures are like in the practice for these societies. They're not abstract. They're not really dealt with through like as they would be in a written culture. They're dealt with at a more like immediate worldly level, right? Where the people are sort of weaved into the world with these things, which is one of the reasons I think bodily markings are more important in that regard. But what I think is, what I think I see happening here is like they're demarcating some differences between this society and like say capitalist society in terms of territorialization, more particularly in terms of like the family as we're used to it seems to be a microcosm for the society. So right, like we all know this, like if you watch like contemporary news in the US, that's one thing that happens, right? They talk about how the family's constructed, and that's how you're supposed to diagnose social health. But in this society, it looks like those conditions aren't present, which is one of the reasons that the Oedipal complex isn't present as a lens for even doing that kind of analysis. And that's when we're talking about like unconscious investment and desiring production, They write, on the contrary, it is evident that the individual and the family, however young, directly invests a social, historical, economic, and political field that is not reducible to any mental structure or affective constellation. So, right, we're looking at how, desiring production and desire, as I think the technical term in psychoanalysis is cathesis, but how there's those libidinal investments, again, those reactionary and revolutionary aspects that also get carried over into an economic field, like Brooks was saying earlier, and how schizoanalysis in this society works without psychoanalysis in that regard and actually goes into the structure and it performs a different kind of analysis than psychoanalysis will later sort of develop, particularly with respect to Oedipus.
Well, and the next paragraph, sorry, go ahead, Bruno.
I think that quote about psychology and the psychic stuff and this stuff, I think what they're referring to actually is the fact that, they're not concerned about cultural. I mean, they're different. They're not anthropologists, right? They're not going. I don't think they're studying like cultural norms. I think what they have in mind is a universal project. So I think in that line, what they're talking about is essentially that they're going to study a universal project from the point of view of, their transcendental unconscious. They've used Kantian critique multiple times here to harken out these, and it's almost something universal in this regard. I think desire machine. They say everything is a machine, and desire machines are their universals. They are universal in this regard. And I think that's what they're actually referring to in that paragraph, that they're going to study it through desiring production.
Yeah, I don't think we disagree, because right, they're looking at those unconscious investments, which is the unconscious, right? We're talking about, if it's libidinal, we're talking about desiring production in that regard. I guess I'm trying to keep the contrast to psychoanalysis because it seems to be critical here, but I don't think we disagree.
Well then, I'm going to go ahead and dive into the next paragraph, because it does get into cures. And I would love to, at some point, understand what their meaning behind cure is, because they use it throughout this. Victor Turner gives a remarkable example of such a cure among the Ndembu. The example is the more striking to our perverted eyes for the fact that at first glance everything appears Oedipal. Effeminate, insufferable, vain, failing at everything he tries, the sick K is preyed upon by the ghost of his maternal grandfather, who cruelly reproaches him. Although the Ndembu are matrilineal and must live with their maternal kin, K has stayed an exceptionally long time in the matrilineage of his father, whose favorite he was, and has entered into marriage with paternal cousins. But with the death of his father he is driven away and returns to the maternal village. There his house expresses his situation well, being wedged between two sectors, the houses of the members of the paternal group and those belonging to his own matrilineage. How does the divination responsible for indicating the cause of the illness proceed, and the medical cure responsible for treating it? The teeth are the cause, the top two incisors of the ancestor hunter, contained in a sacred pouch, but which can escape from the pouch and penetrate the body of the sick man. In order to diagnose and ward off the effects of the incisor, the soothsayer and the medicine man launch into a social analysis concerning the territory and its environs, the chieftainship and its sub-chieftainships, the lineages and their segments, the alliances and the affiliations. They constantly bring to light desire in its relations with political and economic units, the very point on which, moreover, the witnesses try to mislead them. Divination becomes a form of social analysis in the course of which hidden struggles between individuals and factions are brought to light, in such a way they can be treated by traditional ritual methods. The vague nature of mystical beliefs allowing them to be manipulated in relation to a great number of social situations. It seems that the pathological incisor is indeed mainly that of the maternal grandfather, but the latter was a great chief. His successor, the real chief, had to relinquish the throne for fear of being bewitched, and his would-be heir, intelligent and ambitious, does not exercise the power. The actual chief is not the real chief. As for the sick K, He has not been able to assume the role of mediator that could have made him a candidate for chief. Everything becomes complicated because of the colonizer-colonized relations. The English have not recognized the chieftainship. The impoverished village is falling into decrepitude. The two sectors of the village result from a fusion of two groups that have fled the English. The elders bemoan the current decadence. The medicine man does not organize a sociodrama, but a veritable group analysis centering on the sick individual. Giving him potions, attaching horns to his body for drawing up the incisor, making the drums beat, the medicine man proceeds with a ceremony interrupted by halts and fresh departures, flows of all sorts, flows of words and breaks. The members of the village come to talk. The sick subject talks. The ghost is invoked. The medicine man explains. Everything recommences. Drums, chants, trances. It is not only a question of discovering the preconscious investments of a social field by interest, but, more profoundly, its unconscious investments by desire, such as they pass by way of the sick person's marriages. His position in the village, and all the positions of a chief, lived in intensity within the group. I'm not sure there's actually much to discuss here because they actually go into analysis in the next paragraph.
Yeah, I think we can just keep going.
Yeah. It was a really good reading, though. That was really a solid paragraph describing that. I like that. I will go ahead and continue unless someone else wants to dive in. We said that the point of departure seemed Oedipal. It was only the point of departure for us. Conditioned to say Oedipus every time someone speaks to us of father, mother, grandfather. In fact, the Ndingbu analysis was never Oedipal. It was directly plugged into social organization and disorganization. Sexuality itself, through the women and the marriages, was just an investment of desire. The parents played the role of stimuli in it, and not the role of group organizers or disorganizers, the role held by the chief and his personages. Rather than everything being reduced to the name of the father or that of the maternal grandfather, the latter opened onto all the names of history. Instead of everything being projected onto a grotesque hiatus of castration, everything was scattered in the thousand breaks flows of the chieftainships, the lineages, the relations of colonization, the whole interplay of races, clans, alliances, and filiations, this entire historical and collective drift. Exactly the opposite of the Oedipal analysis, when it stubbornly crushes the content of delirium, when it stuffs it with all its might into the symbolic void of the father. Or rather, if it is true that the analysis doesn't even begin as Oedipal, except to our way of seeing, doesn't it become Oedipal nevertheless in a certain way? And in what way? Yes, it becomes Oedipal in part, under the effect of colonization. The colonizer, for example, abolishes the chieftainship or uses it to further his own ends, and he uses many other things besides. The chieftainship is only the beginning. The colonizer says, "Your father is your father and nothing else, or your maternal grandfather. Don't mistake them for chiefs. You can go have yourself triangulated in your corner and place your house between those of your paternal and maternal kin. Your family is your family and nothing else. Sexual reproduction no longer passes through those points, although we rightly need your family to furnish a material that will be subjected to a new order of reproduction. Yes, then, an Oedipal framework is outlined for the dispossessed primitives. A shantytown, Oedipus. As we have seen, however, that the colonized remained a typical example of resistance to Oedipus. In fact, that's where the Oedipal structure does not manage to close itself, and where the terms of the structure remain stuck to the agents of oppressive social reproduction, either in a struggle or in complicity. The white man, the missionary, the tax collector, the exporter of goods, the person standing in the village who becomes the agent of administration, the elders who curse the white man, the young people who enter political struggle, etc. Both are true. The colonized resists Oedipalization, and Oedipalization tends to close around him again. To the degree there is Oedipalization, it is due to colonization, and it is necessary to add Oedipalization to all methods that Jalin was able to describe in La Peau Blanche. The condition of the colonized can lead to a reduction in the humanization of the universe, so that any solution that is sought will be a solution on the scale of the individual and the restricted family, with, by way of consequence, an extreme anarchy of disorder at the level of the collective, an anarchy whose victim will always be the individual. With the exception of those who occupy key positions in such a system, namely the colonizers, who, during this same period when the colonized reduced the universe, will tend to extend it. Oedipus is something like euthanasia within ethnocide. The more social reproduction escapes the members of the group, in nature and in extension, the more it falls back on them, or reduces them to a restricted and neuroticized familial reproduction whose agent is Oedipus. All right, there is a lot that seems to be unpacked here, and actually, I'm not sure that it is a lot. We can go through it point by point, but I'm going to give a quick version of how I read this, and I think I'm sure Varun, and I think everyone's going to have a different take, and I'd really love to get everyone's takes because this is an extremely important paragraph and long as shit. To me, how I'm reading this is through the sort of lens of sort of actor network theory, the idea that we need to understand that the way that the psychoanalytic world that the chieftain, or K in this situation, who's the subject, lives within, he lives outside of Oedipus. However, by being colonized, he actually has become he's actually become affected by Oedipus, because Oedipus by nature is a voracious symbol-eating nightmare that constantly is sort of going into things. And the paragraph is about that sort of journey between the moment before Oedipus actually takes over things, and it runs through all of the different things that can affect and how we see stuff, then how they see stuff, and then actually combined how we see stuff. And that's my quick analysis. Please, Varun, jump in.
Yeah, sorry, I'm a bit lost, but I think, with regards to social, I'd like to read the last line again, because I think that's actually the most interesting here. Oedipus is something like euthanasia with the ethnocide. The more social production escapes the members of the group in nature and in extension, the more it falls back on them, reduces them to a restricted and neuroticized family, a reproduction agent whose agent is Oedipus. So I think we're back at the falling back upon operation, and at least when I read the falling back operation, I read that as something retroactive, right? Where the body without organs comes back on social production, and so I'm at least reading it as it's a sort of, at least in this terms in social production and stuff, it's a form of recoding. It's a form of coding, right? Or recoding in this regard, in the sense that essentially, and I may be wrong on this, I'm maybe being very speculative here, but so essentially, I think with social reproduction escapes members of the group in nature, and an extension, one way, and I go again back to the line about, in terms of their Nietzscheanism, they want to get out of group dynamics, in my opinion. So that's why they bring up the whole idea of like someone who lives outside the symbolic order and all that jazz. But this is essentially, I think these are people who get pulled back in, right? That these are flows that get coded back into the repressive system in a way.
Well, the line in here, there's a lot of lines, and I apologize if we should have broken this paragraph up. I see it as one long sort of vomit of a single thought, because it just is continuous, and one relies so deeply on the previous and next sentence. But there's one in here I really like, that an Oedipal framework is outlined for the dispossessed primitives, a shantytown Oedipus. The idea that there's sort of the colonizer's version of Oedipus that would enter into the sort of what is the term? They keep using the term primitive, and my brain just gets angry every time I want to say it. But the primitive society, the primitive world that these people live in, the Oedipal structure that actually has the ability to take the production that is leaking out and actually turn it back onto them in a shantytown Oedipus, as they put it. The condition of the colonized can lead to a reduction in the humanization of the universe, so that any solution that is sought will be a solution on the scale of the individual and the restricted family. I think it's such a great way to look at it, because it's, again, being very aware of when we look at these original situations, we need to understand the lens we're looking at it with. We need to understand where those people are coming from, what their interactions and social structure ultimately is. And then at the same time, understand that there is that connective tissue of effectively the socius of the future connecting back into the primitive socius that is doing that through Oedipus in this situation.
No, I think that's right on. I just would add, like, part of this goes back to just the reality that, like, Oedipus wanders through discourse like a zombie, right? The very tools and entities that are engaging in this sort of, because this is all heavily based on, like, Calastre's responses to Levi-Strauss, and what they're doing is essentially saying, in the same way that whoever walks into Lacan's session, right, is already Oedipalized. And whoever engages in this sort of cultural anthropology will ascribe Oedipus wherever they see it. And if not, right, they must find a way, because their forms of social production are supposedly reliant on it.
Yeah, but I think we also, at least in my reading, I don't think they're really interested in a super anthropological project, right? Like, I don't think they're really.
No, they're not anthropologists, but, like, you read through this chapter, right, and it's reliant on contemporary anthropology at the time. So, like, yes, like, there is, like, a socio-political project here too, like a universal one, as you keep saying. I'm not going to jump on that train in particular, because that's just not my reading. But I think if we kind of ignore the implications of cultural anthropology here, we might do it to our demise with this reading.
Yeah, it seems to me they're using anthropology to move toward that universal history, or perhaps more appropriately called like a historical genealogy. So, like, I think you're both right.
Exactly.
Yeah, I mean, I think I see it in a similar way, but I think that they are much more concerned about the unconscious in terms of their analysis.
Well, I think for sure. And so, again, I'm going to actually go with Jack here, and I think you're both right. They're not here to become anthropologists or to get us to become that. They're utilizing this as a sort of allegory example to how Oedipus affects all of us at every single point in time. And how it dives its way into everything that it touches. And the primitive socius is just a perfect example of that, because they are not to utilize language that is sort of noble savagery, but the idea of them being almost pure. There is no Oedipal intention there. There's no reality of that. They deal with the material realities around them in a very specific way, where they're connected to the earth. Things are what they are, or there's almost a concretization of everything. And there is no massive overcoding as there is in economics. So how quickly and how does Oedipus bleed in? And I mean, the next paragraph is, how are we to understand those who claim to have discovered Indian Oedipus or African Oedipus? I think that this is, as they go forward, they're talking about how these things sort of bled into each other, because the very nature of Oedipus as being this sort of thought zombie, I like that travels, like if the schizo is able to be the nomad traveling along the body without organs, Oedipus is like this fucking zombie that's able to eat anything when it comes to productive machines, social production. That and what it shits out is, it shits out the same size triangle that is Oedipus with everything it eats, and it's voracious and it never fucking stops. And
I think we're going to see a similar thing when they start talking about capitalism and stuff like that.
Yes, no, for sure.
I think you see that also, at least in the way Marx describes capitalism, the Communist Manifesto and stuff. So it's all there.
Actually, it is really similar. It is really similar. But let's really quick. I'm going to read the asterisk, which was at the bottom, because it also sort of adds a little bit color to this, and then we'll move on to the next paragraph. But as I mentioned earlier, La Paix Blanche, the condition of the colonized, continues on. Jeanlin analyzes the situation of those Indians whom the Capuchins persuaded to abandon the collective house in favor of small personal houses. In the collective house, the familial apartment and personal intimacy were based on a relationship with the neighbor defined as an ally, so that interfamilial relations were coextensive with the social field. In the new situation, on the contrary, and this is post-Oedipus coming in, essentially, in the new situation, on the contrary, there occurred an excessive ferment of the elements of the couple affecting the couple itself and the children, so that the restrictive family closes into an expressive microcosm where each person reflects his own lineage, while the social and productive destiny escapes him more and more. For Oedipus is not only an ideological process, but the result of a destruction of the environment, the habitat, etc. And I'm just going to continue right into the next paragraph because it continues really nicely. How are we to understand those who claim to have discovered an Indian Oedipus or an African Oedipus? They are the first to admit that they re-encounter none of the mechanisms or attitudes that constitute our own Oedipus, our own presumed Oedipus. No matter, they say, the structure is there, although it has no existence whatever that is accessible to clinical practice, or that the problem, the point of departure, is indeed Oedipal, although the developments and the solutions are completely different from ours. They say that there is no end to the existence of Oedipus, when in fact it does not even have, apart from colonization, the necessary conditions to begin to exist. If that is true, if it is true that thought can be evaluated in terms of the degree of Oedipalization, then yes, whites think too much. The competence, the honesty, and the talent of these authors, psychoanalysts specializing in Africa, are beyond question. But the same applies to them as to certain psychotherapists here. It would seem that they don't know what they are doing. We have psychotherapists who sincerely believe they are engaged in progressive work when they apply new methods for triangulating the child. But watch out. A structural Oedipus, and this time it isn't imaginary. The same is true of the psychoanalysts in Africa who apply a yoke of structural or problematical Oedipus in the service of their progressive intentions. There or here, it's the same thing. Oedipus is always colonization pursued by other means. It is the interior colony, and we shall see that even here at home, where we Europeans are concerned, it is our intimate colonial education. Continuing basically what we said off the previous paragraph, Oedipus being the fucking zombie that cannot stop.
It is a discourse zombie.
Discourse zombie. Oedipal zombie, I like as a thought because it helps. It's the allegory always helps me understand a lot of these concepts, and that actually helps a lot more of this chapter kick into place for me. Oedipal zombie.
It's part of the reason why, like, I love the commentators that use Anti-Oedipus at the level of the cultural, like Mark Fisher and those, is that they use these tools to, like, I think he uses the thing to describe capitalism operating in the third chapter of Anti-Oedipus, and that was one that I also liked as well. So I have the same issue with this text too, Brooks.
Yeah, I think I think I see two things in this paragraph. Like, I think one, I think we can take from a more contemporary approach when reading something like this. It's, it's starting someone else and they're just like, oh, yeah, but who cares? Oedipus is just, this is all just like, they just said like the classic, like, oh, Freud was all bullshit, blah, blah, blah. This is all, who cares, right? I mean, it's so there's, and I think it's also harkened back in this paragraph. In chapter 2, they talked about how, Oedipus is actually a lot more terrifying when people think it's just ideology, when people think
exactly.
It's when people think it's just not happening, right? It's not real. Because then what's happening is, the material flow is being Oedipalized, and it's being Oedipalized while they're unconscious of it completely, because, they're just said, oh, it's just ideology, blah, blah, blah. It is not real. And essentially what happens is, subjects are being Oedipalized. And another thing, a similar thing, I think they talk about, so another thing that we see in that chapter also in terms of the incorrect use of the conjunctive synthesis and stuff, when they talk about like the revolutionary, right? They say that a subject can be consciously reactionary and unconsciously revolutionary. At the same time, the subject can also be consciously revolutionary and unconsciously reactionary. So it's a really interesting, I think, dichotomy, or even I might not like to say dichotomy because that's like a problem with people like Deleuze and stuff. But it's a really interesting relationship. I think what they describe the psychoanalyst in this regard. And also, I mean, that it also comes back to the whole idea of desiring your own repression, blah blah blah, that whole jazz. But I think it's really interesting. I mean, the way they put the primacy to the unconscious in this regard.
Yeah, I think it speaks to the comparison between the medicine man using schizoanalysis and like the way that cultural anthropology or even like history at this time, contemporary for Deleuze and Guattari, as we said, has this tendency to read things through its own milieu, so to impose Oedipus on that, and even began a kind of kind of like lean on some of Varun's terms, like a hermeneutical Oedipalization or colonialization. But I think it's interesting too if you compare that with like what they write about the medicine man and how like a kind of schizoanalysis seems to be present, where it is not only a question of discovering the preconscious investments of the social field by interest, but more profoundly, its unconscious investments by desire, such as they pass by way of the sick person's marriages, his position in the village, and all the positions of achieve lived in intensity within the group. One thing that interests me so far in this section is like, and I think we talked about this earlier, is like sort of like an ethicality involved with territorialization, right? Because even that sounds kind of painful. But that being said, it's interesting that the schizoanalysis here seems to directly deal and engage like the breaks and flows that would come with a territorialization, and to look at like how the person's moving throughout that structure, how the structure is engaging them as well. Because in that example, it seemed like the person who's sick is not even remotely at full fault for it. So it's interesting to take that position on schizoanalysis and compare it with like trying to psychoanalyze African people.
All right. Well, with that, I'm going to go ahead and anyone want to read the next paragraph? I'm happy to. It's not a problem. All right. How are we to understand the phrases with which M.C. and Edmund Ortega, I'm not going to pronounce this, conclude their book? Illness is considered as a sign of an election, of a special attention coming from supernatural powers, or as a sign of an aggression of a magical nature, an idea that is difficult to express in profane terms. Analytic psychotherapy can intervene only starting from the moment a demand can be formulated by the subject. Our entire research was therefore conditioned by the possibility of establishing a psychoanalytic domain. When a subject adhered fully to the traditional norms and had nothing to say in his own name, he allowed himself to be taken into care of the traditional therapists and the familial group, or into that of the medical practice of medicines. At times, the fact that he wanted to speak to us about traditional treatments corresponded to a beginning of psychotherapy and became for him a means of situating himself personally in his own society. At other times, the analytic dialogue was able to unfold to a greater extent, and in this case, the Oedipal problem tended to assume its diachronic dimension, causing the generation gap to appear. Why think that supernatural powers and magical aggressions constitute a myth that is inferior to Oedipus? On the contrary, is it not true that they move desire in the direction of more intense and more adequate investments of the social field, in its organization as well as disorganizations? Meyer Fortes at least showed Job's place beside Oedipus, and what entitles one to determine that the subject has nothing to say in his own name, so long as he adheres to the traditional norms. Doesn't the Ndembu cure demonstrate just the opposite? Could it not be said that Oedipus is also a traditional norm? Our own, to be exact. How can one say that Oedipus makes us speak in our own name, when one also goes on to say that its resolution teaches us the incurable inadequacy of being and universal castration? And what is this demand that is invoked to justify Oedipus? It goes without saying, the subject demands and redemands daddy-mommy. But which subject, and in what state? Is that the means to situate oneself personally in one's own society? And which society? The neo-colonized society that is constructed for the subject and that finally succeeds in what colonization was only able to outline? An effective reduction of the forces of desire to Oedipus to a father's name in the grotesque triangle? One thing I will say, they've basically mentioned the name of the father 4 or 5 times in here in really shitty ways, and I just would love to have been like watching Lacan as he read this. Like, just shitting all over him. I don't have any major things to add here. In short, basically, they are taking the concept of Oedipus, and they're taking it sort of against what we would see as primitive spells and magic and rituals, and saying, this is ours, and it's actually really, really terrifying one. And the ones before also organized desire. They organized, the break apart of things, but ours tends to take over. Any other thoughts quickly?
I think you nailed it.
All right. A lot of this, I think we're going to do. There's a handful of paragraphs I know we're going to stop and have long discussions on, but I think a lot of this is, again, very concretized and very direct. So we'll do quick summaries as we sort of charge through.
Brooks, there's a question for you in the chat.
Oh no, a Lacan question.
Exactly. I forgot the name of the father. When I was reading about the phallus and the Oedipus complex, it's an annoying sort of concept. It's not literally the father's name, but it's
not. My dad's name is Randy, and at no point would Lacan go, cool. Well, we're going to talk about Randy as the name of the father. It's the support of it's the symbolic function of the concept of father.
That's actually the entirety of I think when it comes to that concept, it's a perfect example of the Lacanian project, is that sort of creating kind of this don't dumb it down, I'll fucking kill you. But this creation of a more abstract version of these already operating concepts within psychoanalysis. At least that's what I get from looking awry. I'm not a Lacanian, not schooled in that whatsoever.
Yeah, I know Herms is big into Lacan, though. I think I was hoping he could help us out a bit.
Ooh, let's see. Do we have Hermes here?
Yeah, hey. I just popped in, so I wasn't able to hear what D&G were saying about the name of the father. Is there?
Well, they basically should on it over and over and over, more as a side reference. But we had a question of literally what name of the father means, because that adds context to why they're shitting on it. Like, they don't say anything specifically as a breakdown or a critique. They literally just go, what is it, the name of the father? And then move on to the next thing. So
yeah, I can say what I know about it. I'm not like a Lacanian expert. I've only read like a few seminars, but I did the one. So seminar 3, the psychoses, presents the name of the father as the signifier that keeps the signifying chain moving, that it provides a bound to signification, and he makes it. He says it's like the marriage ring, but it's also the no of the father in a sense. But that's not quite it. The root of the name of the father is that it's the signifier that gives a bound to signification. That way, the signifying chain can keep moving along.
And there's three levels of the father: the symbolic, the imaginary, and the real. Because everything with Lacan has fucking every level that there is. And so it's an incredibly complex thing if you really want to get into it. There's an excellent book called Name of the Father about Lacan. I have it on my bookshelf. I'll find the author. But it's a really again, we're talking about them shitting on the concept of just in general anything Oedipal, but specifically here, to me, the way that the symbolic father sort of plays a role is they're the ones who give credence to the idea of how the symbolic order works, and that if you have a good father, you will understand how the world works and you'll behave well inside of it, and you'll know your place within the social order. And a shitty father, which I think Zizek called the anal father, because that's not an awkward phrasing at all, is the opposite of that, and actually is what ultimately will put you into psychosis, if I'm not wrong there, Hermes. Like, that's one of the driving factors.
Yeah, and a name of the name of a father can be like a meta myth, like Christianity can serve as being the name of a father.
Yes.
Yeah, it allows you to symbolize events, and also an important part about the Oedipal thing is, so what Lacan does is he says that it's not just the parents, like events in general can serve the function of father and mother, whether it's whether an event is prohibitive or provides that impossible jouissance, being the feminine side.
So specifically, to quote from Wikipedia, why not? This paternal function imposes the law and regulates desire within the Oedipal complex, intervening in the imaginary dual relationship between mother and child to introduce a necessary symbolic distance between them. This is the name of the father is where the Oedipal hey, I want to fuck my mom. No, you can't. I'm your dad. That moment is when it's like, oh, you've symbolically been given that. Here's how things work.
Yeah, and so he does the Lacanian play on words, the non-do pair, right? And he says those that don't buy into the symbolic fiction err most. And I don't know about that, but that's what he says. And it seems like that's what D&G are actually railing against, is the symbolic fiction.
Very much. I mean, a lot of Lacan stuff is about the regulation of desire, which I think they're just patently against as a concept. Let's see. Anything else while I'm reading through? No. There's a few good books. I'll link to. I'll toss them in the chat in a moment. Give me 2 seconds. Talk amongst yourselves.
Yeah, I think the Van Hout against adaptation is like supposed to be. I think it's actually quite harder than Bruce Fink's guide, but I think it's supposed to be a good authoritative source, at least on the early thought with regards to the Akrian stuff.
Yeah, I've been reading it, and it's very good.
And real quick, it's of course Bruce Fink's translation of On the Names of the Father. Bruce Fink is the guy for that. So worth reading. I'm going to spend a little bit of time going over this as we talk about other stuff. But anything else on this section, on this paragraph?
Yes, Alyosha has a question. They ask, would D&G say there are no bounds to signification? And then Alyosha expands to say, I just mean in the idea that there's a master signifier that moves anything versus signifiers producing endlessly without meaning.
I mean, I think with regard, so in Lacan's case, the signifier of the unconscious that sort of structures the whole thing is like the point de capiton, right? So for Lacan, it'll be the phallus or the non-penis, as he says, that acts as the signifier. But I think for Deleuze and Guattari, it has to do with, this gets a lot more complex. Now we're dealing with something much more material rather than, something ideal as a signifier. So, and by ideal, I mean like, mental stuff. So if with regards to Deleuze and Guattari, I think there's this. It depends on the extraction of the surplus value of the code, and the functioning of the body without organs within the system, right? Of whether it's attracting or repulsing.
Wouldn't something like a master signifier be like a third synthesis paralogism, though?
Exactly. Yeah. Master signifier. No, I don't. How does? I don't think. What do you mean by? But I mean, it's like despotic signifier is the paralogism, right? Where you get like the phallus for Deleuze and Guattari, like it's going to be a signal. It's going to be a paralogism, right? Because it's extracting. It's basically taking up everything into one extraction. I mean, it's binding everything up into one locale almost.
I'm actually going to jump in because I think the next paragraph is perfect for this. We tend to do this. I do like that we tend to have discussions where it's like, oh, actually, the next paragraph addresses greatly the great signifier and the dead father and so many symbols inside of that it would be worth going through and then continuing the discussion afterwards. Anyone have any final thoughts before I dive in, though? All right.
Yeah.
No, go ahead.
I mean, it's sort of off topic, but I mean, like Guattari solo thought the 80s with like schizoanalytic cartographies. I mean, what he started doing was he started taking all these signifiers. He created like biological signifiers too, right? With hormonal transfers. So you have like asemiotic chains that are hormonal transfers, and then you still have the asignifying chains. And then you also have diagrammatic recordings, right? So it's like that goes into modeling, that you have models that record as functions. So it starts getting really crazy if you go into the whole thing in the 80s with the rest of Thousand Plateaus as well.
Cool. Let us return to the well-known and inexhaustible debate between culturalists and orthodox psychoanalysts. Is Oedipus universal? Is Oedipus the great paternal Catholic symbol, the meeting place of all churches? The debate began between Malinowski and Jones. It continued between Gardner and Fromm on one side and Roheim on the other. It is still pursued between ethnologists and certain disciples of Lacan, those who offered not only an Oedipalizing interpretation of Lacan's doctrine, but also an ethnographic extension to this interpretation. On the side of the universal, there are two poles. One, outdated, it would seem, that makes of Oedipus an original affective constellation, and that constitutes an extreme position arguing that Oedipus was a real event whose effects were transmitted through phylogenetic heredity. And on the other pole, which makes Oedipus into a structure, a pole whose extreme position argues the possibility of discovering the structure in fantasy in relation to biological prematuration and neoteny. Two very different conceptions of the limit, one as an original matrix, the other as structural function. But in both these senses of the universal, we are invited to interpret, since the latent presence of Oedipus appears only through its patent absence, understood as an effect of psychic repression. Or better still, since the structural constant is discovered only through its imaginary variations, attesting to the need for the symbolic foreclosure, the father as an empty position. Oedipus as universal recommences the old metaphysical operation that consists in interpreting negation as a deprivation, as a lack, the symbolic lack of the dead father or the great signifier. Interpretation is our modern way of believing and of being pious. Already, Gezer-Roheim proposed organizing primitives into a series of variables converging towards the structural neotenic constant. It was he who said, in all seriousness, that the Oedipus complex was not to be found if it wasn't looked for, and that one wasn't looking if one hadn't had oneself analyzed. And that is why your daughter is mute, which is to say, the tribes, daughters of the ethnologist, do not say Oedipus, although it is Oedipus who makes them speak. Roheim added that it was ridiculous to think that the Freudian theory of censorship depended on the repressive regime in the empire of Franz Josef. He did not seem to see that Franz Josef was not a pertinent historical break, but that perhaps the oral, the written, or even the capitalist civilizations were such breaks within the nature of social repression, and the meaning and scope of psychic repression would vary.
Yeah, I think it's a, if you remember correctly, psychic repression is almost like so where Freud put the primacy to psychic repression, Deleuze put primacy to social repression. And, they're not the first people to do that, actually. The first people to do that was Wilhelm Reich, right? Except Wilhelm Reich, they say, had a dualism. He had a dualism in the sense that he divided desire and production and social production rather than keeping it into one sort of production, which caused him to not have a full enough analysis. And so if psychic repression is the almost instrument of social repression, the task of psychic repression, it causes us to desire more social repression. And in this case, we can understand social repression, I think, through, I don't know if it's correct, but through the recording of the prohibition of incest as a representation that causes the guilt of desire to be snared in this specific location. And, so it turns into, so that's what I wanted. Even though it was the prohibition, right? There's nothing, and there's no real flow of desire, but the flows were guided through various forms of coding, where coding decided to go and decide, so, that's what you wanted, as they quote directly. I think a good example, at least Buchanan gives this, for the example of how the prohibition of incest works as actually causing desire to desire incest, is in the sense that, he gives the example of couples who were, at least back I'm not American, but I think back in the United States, there was a great taboo placed on sex before marriage and stuff. And so, so what happened actually, but it's from that taboo that the desire to have sex before marriage actually increased in a way. So, it's from the taboo that the possibility actually becomes actualized. And except in terms of the prohibition of incest, it's terms of guilt, where a desire feels guilty and it gets turned in or binded into something like, that's what I wanted.
I also think it's really important just because it's a thing they continually go over, but they mention it very specifically here that Oedipus' universal recommences the old metaphysical operation that consists in interpreting negation as a deprivation, as a lack. And as we know, don't believe in lack. Desire is not an imaginary force that is based on lack. I think they could not say that more times and be more clear on that. And a lot of what they're talking about is that moment of symbolic foreclosure that happens within Oedipus, and that the lack is the thing that drives us, the production of a lack. Yes, thank you. Lack can be created through production, but lack doesn't drive desire. Am I wrong on that? Am I misreading?
If I remember correctly, they also say that it's a paralogism of the first synthesis to understand lack as a kind of absence or a zero sort of thing. Rather, the first syllogism understands that if there is a kind of lack, it is a deprivation.
Well, this paragraph they talk also about, and I don't know how relevant it is to necessarily our discussion understanding of it, because it seems like this is a very specific, the first half of this paragraph is a very specific call out on some very specific things happening around Oedipus within the psychoanalytic community, given Lacan and given everyone else. I think that's all their references that they're making. The idea here that they really want to get at is that people are talking about universality of Oedipus as, on the one side, being purely structural, that this is how reality is built, and then on the other side actually saying that, no, this is a real event, these are real things, it's a thing that happens and is part of our entire setup. So the ability for us to instead step back from that, and again, they shit on Lacan pretty significantly, and instead talk about sort of the retconning of everything via Oedipus. Feels more like retconning might be the best word to use for Oedipus in this.
Yeah, it's so that's what I wanted, right? It's a retroactive sort of application.
Retconning is if you're not familiar, pop culture term for when someone decides to change the storyline of a universe, and they retcon that George Lucas goes back and makes it so it's Greedo who shoots first, not Han. That retcons things. It's a good term, I think, for this specifically, because it does, in its event nature, Oedipus being introduced sort of changes everything as it fits its own lens through the past. Any other thoughts?
I did really like that line about interpretation, which now that I've looked up, I might not be able to find. Well, here we go. But in those senses of the universal, we are invited to so-called interpret, since the latent presence of Oedipus appears only through its patent absence, understood as an effect of psychic repression, where they go on to say, interpretation is our modern way of believing and of being pious. Which, like, I kind of read too as like, there's a danger in interpretation by means of trying to use some sort of, shall we say, master signifier or that, by which to understand all things and therefore like preserve the signifier there.
All right. I'll continue to the next paragraph. This story of psychic repression is quite complicated. I think we've learned that by now. Things would be simpler if the libido or the affect were repressed, in the most general sense of the word, suppressed, inhibited, transformed, at the same time as the supposed Oedipal representation. But such is not the case. Most ethnologists have clearly noted the sexual nature of affects in the public symbols of primitive societies, and this nature remains integrally lived by the members of these societies, even though they have not been psychoanalyzed, and in spite of the displacement of the representation. As Leach says, apropos of the sex-hair relationship, displaced phallic symbolism is very common, but the phallic origin of the symbolism is not repressed. Must it be said that primitives repress the representation and keep the affect intact? I would love someone to explain that sentence to me later, by the way. And would the contrary be true in our case, in the patriarchal organization where the representation would remain clear, but with the affect suppressed, inhibited, and transformed? No, in fact. Psychoanalysis tells us that we too repress the representation, and everything tells us that we too often keep the full sexuality of the effect. We know perfectly well what it is about without having been psychoanalyzed, but what enables one to speak of an Oedipal representation that would be the object of repression? Is it because incest is prohibited? We always fall back on this pale rationale. Incest is desired because it is prohibited. The prohibition of incest would therefore imply an Oedipal representation, and it would be born of the repression of this representation of the latter's return. Jesus Christ, is that a sentence? I'm going to reread it. The prohibition of incest would therefore imply an Oedipal representation, and it would be born of the repression of this representation and of the latter's return. Now the opposite is clearly the case. Not only does Oedipal representation presuppose the prohibition of incest, but it is not even possible to say that the representation is born of the prohibition or results from it. Well, let's go with let's break this down. I'm going to ask questions because it's
go for it.
This paragraph for sure loses me just in general because there's a lot of psychoanalytic talk that I don't get. So let's say the question I asked, would the contrary be true in our case in the patriarchal organization where the representation would remain clear but with the affect suppressed, inhibited, and transformed? Can someone explain to me just in general?
I think the way I'm actually confused on the context in this case, but I think affectivities with regards to intensities, right, in terms of when they talk about, I think you see this most clearly in the paralogism of the conjunctive synthesis, but when they talk about, the schizo who he hallucinates delirium, and in this case, by hallucinating delirium, rather than identifying with the he identifies with the intensities, right, rather than anything else, and it's that affectivity of I feel like I'm becoming woman, or they say becoming Negro in that case, where he identifies with these sort of affectivities, and that's when the name comes in, right? And that's the whole nomadism that goes along with that. But the whole idea is that the schizo identifies with the affectivity of intensities, and the name is sort of that sort of signifier, I think. But I'm I'm not sure how it's been used in this context.
So the last sentence is the one I like. It feels like I've just reread this a second time. I hate this paragraph. The last sentence, I'm going to say that I would love to just spend some time breaking down, and I'm going to ramble. And Will, Muskie, anyone, please, we would love all of you to jump in. Not only does the Oedipal representation presuppose the prohibition of incest, but it is not even possible to say that the representation is born of the prohibition or results from it. So the last sentence implies or is saying that the previous paragraph or even leading up to this point is that saying that Oedipus is a representation by nature presupposes that we cannot fuck our moms, that there is a prohibition, that these things are intertwined. Again, talking about sort of retconning. If we want to sit there and say Oedipus exists, Oedipus is a real thing, we can't, it's because we want to fuck our moms, we're not allowed to fuck our moms. Their second half of that sentence says it's not even possible to say the representation is born of the prohibition or results from it. So because for fuck's sake, because Oedipus as a concept is created, by creating the concept, we're saying that there is a prohibition against fucking our moms, right? At the same time, because the representation has retconned this, it's actually impossible for us to go say that this ever existed at a real point, a concrete material point in time. We can't say. We can't say that this ever actually fucking happened. We can't say that there's a prohibition. We can't say this results from the prohibition because of the fact that it is retconning everything to this. That's how I'm reading that last sentence.
Yeah, you want me to try and break this down with some terminology then?
Sure, but I think, can I just do like a Sood sort of like reading of this? Like, it's because it's like impossible, right? Like in this framework, it's like literally impossible for that prohibition at any point in time to have been made. Does that make sense? Like, it doesn't even make 100% sense to me, but that's at least what I'm getting here, is that the act of the prohibition can't be determined because like the very act within this triangle is impossible within itself. Like you cannot fuck your mother in this context of the Oedipal triangle, because like the very purpose of those roles in that is that this is actually like an impossibility, and it becomes more clear like later and explicitly stated that action under this framework like is semiotically impossible.
Yeah, I think so. With regards, the repressing representation in this case is it's almost like the signifier of the prohibition, and the signifier is incest. And then, I mean, they talk about it in the last chapter. We were told about a displaced representative, which was, that's the distorted image. It's desire as functioning as desire for the mother, desire to fuck the mother and kill the father, and in. And then there's the third term, which is actually the referent, which refers to desire, and it's in its true germinal force, or its true desire and production force, where it's that essential molecular nature to it. But I'm a bit lost now, because so they say that now the opposite is clearly the case. Not only does the Oedipus representation presuppose the prohibition of incest, yeah, so I can agree with that, because we saw that. Oedipus is not something ingrained, right? It's caused by something from outside, or in the social field, in this case, the prohibition of incest. But it's not even possible to say that the representation is born of the prohibition or results from it. So, I mean, but then they clearly say that they can't say that that it's the prohibition. See, it's almost very confusing, because it not only does the Oedipal representation presuppose the prohibition of incest, so they're saying if we have Oedipal as desire, then we must have a prohibition of incest that we saw from social repression. But it's not even possible to say that the representation is born of the prohibition or results from it. So they're saying also that maybe am I correct to say that they're saying then the prohibition may not be the cause? It's almost like they have a contradiction there.
It reads to me as though they're saying that that's almost the wrong question. That It's not so much that was the prohibition the cause? Was it not? It's, as I'm reading that last sentence, it's not possible for us to actually say that we use these terms as sort of conversation pieces, but it is not possible to say that the representation Oedipus is born of the prohibition or results from it. That because of the fact, again, the prior line, not only does Oedipal representation presuppose the prohibition of incest, by having Oedipus just as a thing, the way that it is built into its own structure, you cannot have incest. Like, that's the nature of Oedipus at a basic level. It's one of the core things. So because that structure is something itself that prohibits and has it built in, we actually can't go back and say which came first. It's a chicken or egg question. They both effectively came about at the same time.
Yeah, but I think, they'd be fairly against to say that Oedipus came first, right? Because that's, one of the main theses of the book is they can never say Oedipus came first in this regard, because that will imply that psychic repression is before social repression.
I don't think they're saying Oedipus came first, and I don't think they're saying. I think they're saying that you can't say that it's not them saying decisively one way or another. I mean, that's how that sentence reads. It's not even possible to say the representation is born of the prohibition or results from it.
So why they write it like this? It's almost like they're doing some Derrida-style satire or something.
It's almost like Kierkegaard taking jabs at Hegel, right? Like writing in an intentionally obtuse way. But no, I think Brooks got it. Is that, and apologies if you can hear like the air conditioning in the back, and whoever has to edit this later, you can just delete whatever I say. I think Brooks has it. Like, so throughout this, like he's saying, "Oh, I don't get it. Please explain it to me." But like, I think you're the one here that at least has gotten closest to this.
It just feels so, and we can continue on, but it's instead of them saying one thing came before the other, it's very much we've gotten to a point because of how Oedipus works, because it is this zombie that eats. If a zombie eats and shits out triangles, can we say that it ever ate a triangle? Like, it's not possible because everything it shits out is triangles. So it's there's no way for us to really know. I'm actually going to read, because the next paragraph gets into this as well. I read ahead a little bit because and there's no way we're getting through the section fully. So we're going to be taking a break at some point here because there's no way we read through this whole thing. But I think we're going to get a lot deeper into Oedipus versus incest and where it sits. Adopting Malinowski's arguments, Reich added a profound remark. Desire is all the more Oedipal as the prohibitions are aimed, not simply at incest, but at all other types of sexual relations, blocking the other paths. In a word, the repression of incest is not born of a repressed Oedipal representation any more than it provokes this repression. But, and this is something altogether different, the general social repression, psychic repression system gives rise to an Oedipal image as a disfiguration of the repressed. The fact that this image in turn finally suffers a repression, that it comes to take the place of the repressed or of the thing that is effectively desired insofar as sexual repression is directed at something other than incest, such is the long history of our society. But the repressed is not first of all the Oedipal representation. What is repressed is desiring production. It is the part of this production that does not enter into social production or reproduction. It is what would introduce disorder and revolution into the socius, the non-coded flows of desire. The part that passes, on the contrary, from desiring production to social production, forms a direct sexual investment of this social production, without any repression of a sexual nature of the symbolism and the corresponding affects, and above all, without any reference to the Oedipal representation that could be held to be originally repressed or structurally foreclosed. The animal in us is not merely the object of a preconscious investment determined by interest, but the object of a libidinal investment of desire that only secondarily derives an image of the father from desiring production. The same holds true for the libidinal investment of food, wherever a fear of going hungry is evident or a pleasure at not being hungry. And this investment refers only secondarily to an image of the mother. I'm just going to read the asterisk while we're there. In his study of the Marquesa Islands, Adam Gardner has convincingly demonstrated that role of a collective or economic elementary anxiety that, even from the viewpoint of the unconscious, does not allow itself to be reduced to the familial relationship with the mother. We have already seen how the prohibition of incest referred, not to Oedipus, but to the non-coded flows that constitute desire, and to their representative, the intense prepersonal flow. As for Oedipus, it is another way of coding the uncodable, of codifying what eludes the codes, or of displacing desire and its object, a way of entrapping them.
So, as for Oedipus, it is another way of coding the uncodable, of codifying what eludes the codes, or of displacing desire in such a way of entrapping them. So, I mean, in terms of coding, for Oedipalized desire, at least on the level of the body without organs, the ambivalence of the body without organs arises in the fact that it will record, at least if it's not, it will record those repressing representations as well. Or unless the schizo falls on the full body without organs, which is they describe it as autism. But as for Oedipus, it is the case that, in the way that they describe it here, Oedipus has to be recorded onto desire. It has to be a code in a way so that, because coding is the operation that moves the flows in a certain way. Coding so the body without organs, remember, it doesn't produce or doesn't disproduce. It just nudges and it tells them where to go, right? So it's from that Oedipal code that the desire knows to go in a specific way. I think that's what they mean by trapping.
I think so too. To use the sort of river and water metaphors again, they're talking about uncoded flows. If we talk about river has just going along, and part of it is as pressure is being able to be used directly for production. I have a mill and a water wheel, and that's how I'm using that. The rest of that water is still traveling quite powerfully, and desire operates the same way. It's going. Desire is charging ahead, and by being able to say, oh, actually, here's Oedipus, and we throw the triangle down, or the Oedipal zombie, or however we want to say it. But we begin to code that river, but we do it in this way of repression, which is what they're talking about. That I almost sit Oedipus down in the flow, and I'm stopping the uncoded part. I'm stopping the part that isn't directly productive, that is able to actually drive revolutionary emancipatory thought and action. They say that very directly here a couple times, which I really, really like. To just reread, where was it? Crap. What is repressed is desiring production. It is the part of this production that does not enter into social production or reproduction. It is what would introduce disorder and revolution into the socius, the non-coded flows of desire. And by saying, oh, actually, just so you know, those uncoded flows, it's that you want to fuck your mom, and here's Oedipus, and here's all of it. And it's that they almost happen simultaneously by placing it, the Oedipal triangle, the mold, into those flows. At the same time, we create the desire for incest. At the same time, we prohibit it. This is how we turn those things into moment. Is that a fair?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. No, I think that's great. In fact, that's helpful for me. I've been a little bit lost on this section here too. It only gets worse from here. But yeah.
Well, it's the interesting part here I liked is the part that passes, on the contrary, from desiring production to social production forms a direct sexual investment of the social production without any repression of sexual nature of the symbolism in the corresponding affects, and above all, without any reference to Oedipal representation that be held to be originally repressed or structurally foreclosed. There's again, the desire for them, everything is sexual. At the same time, it's all also like it's not directly sexual in the way that we may mean it, but there's a libidinal power, a sexual procreative power behind all desire. I really like that.
There's libidinal processes everywhere, right? Like the famous quote from this text is the way the bourgeoisie fucks the proletariat, right? So we're starting to edge our way closer and closer to kind of a schizoanalytic view of a materialist psychiatry, but two, like the Wilhelm Reich part of this, it will remain active and critiqued throughout from here on out.
Yeah, and really quick, Big Bud Bart McCoy. I'm going to end up. I've made a note. I need to write up like a little essay on this zombie because I really like the idea of the Oedipal zombie. The idea is Oedipus itself is voracious and never full, able to basically take in any symbiotics, any symbols, any desire production, any uncoded flows. It can take them out, and as it does take them, it shits out triangles. And the triangle is Oedipus. All the desires it takes in, it can find a way to mash them into whatever form it needs in order to make them Oedipalized. And the question,
and in a sense, like Lacan makes it impossible to kill, right? So, yes. Like in a certain way, that the Freudian representation is one that's easily denied in contemporary social constructions, or at least like so we think, right? But with Lacan, the creation of the symbolic order makes it really, really, really difficult to do away with.
And so if you have this thing that's basically eating uncoded flows and turning them and forming them into basically triangle shits of Oedipus, at any point, if you were to actually just sit there and go, okay, so did the zombie actually ever eat an Oedipal symbol? Like, did it ever, before it digested, did it ever have something that was actually shaped in the shape of a triangle? You'd never be able to know, because in the moment of the zombie eating and digesting, it turns everything into triangles. So therefore, it never stops, and like, you're never able to know.
Who is patient zero of kind of the Oedipal contagion is kind of part of the greatest issue that those at Guattari have here is that it can be whatever you want it to be, baby. Is that it can always reformulate and push you back in to this triangle. I'm reminded of the comic where like the little blob tries to get out of its little square and then it's punched back in, right? There's a kind of an inescapability in psychoanalysis beyond just like the old-fashioned like Karl Popper critiques of Freud or whatever. But yeah.
So can I ask a question?
Please.
I managed to get my mic working here. So I was saying in the chat, like, is it what they're saying that incest is not, the desire for it is not a product of an incest prohibition, because what is prohibited or repressed isn't in fact incest, but just any uncoded flow of desire. And for them, all flows of desire are inherently libidinal, including what we've talked about in the past, like the schizophrenic kind of whole experience of their flows of desire, which normally wouldn't be read that way in classical psychoanalysis. So like at the end of that paragraph, when they say it's not even possible to say that the representation is born of the prohibition or results from it, I think, is it that the reason we were getting confused there is because it seems like they were saying the opposite, when what they're really saying was like, it's wrong to assume the prohibition is any kind of originary act. When you put it in this like larger scope, it's really just, I mean, it's like an anti-production, or, you know, that prohibition isn't originary towards anything else. It's actually a quite later stage in this process that is trying to repress and respond to uncoded flows. Does that make sense?
I actually think what you're saying, to my reading, is spot on. This excess uncoded flow by nature is sexual, is libidinal, and therefore it's got some emancipatory revolutionary quality as it gets going. The need that we have, the need that Oedipus has by attaching to it, basically says, oh yeah, all of this sexual desire, it's actually because you want to fuck your mom and you're a gross person for doing that. That's a gross thing that you want to do, so you're bad. And this repression sort of takes place. That is necessary inside of the Oedipal triangle. And so that's essentially what they're saying, is that is what is I think we're saying the same thing, Alyosha.
Yeah, I think so. I'm just trying to wrap my head around it because I think I was also really, really stuck on that paragraph.
It's not that the desire emerges from the prohibition. The more I read and reread that, the more I reread that last sentence of the previous thing, it's not so much they use the term malformed and a malformation, and that it disfigures desire. Think of it almost like a Frankenstein kind of thing, where Frankenstein's not a man anymore. But is it a man? Which came first? It's like, no. The reality is here that the Oedipal shape, by placing it and putting it in the way of the libidinal energies and desires that people have, it malforms everything into making us think that these are desires. I've never had the desire to fuck my mom. Sorry, Mom. I don't know if you're listening. It's not a thing I've ever had, and I think most people generally don't sort of live with that. But it's a drive of a way that we make people think that we want to do that. Is that making sense? So it's like a false desire. I don't know how else to put that.
Yeah. But the very problem is that it becomes actualized. That's the problem.
It does become actualized, and they talk about that a little bit. It's through the continuous repression, then it becomes. But it's not so much that, hey, Oedipus exists and therefore the desire is created. The desire didn't exist before it, and the desire doesn't exist because of it. They kind of come in a package, and it's because sort of at the moment of the repression of these flows, Oedipus creates all of these other things, and we have to have somewhere to put the sexual energy. And Oedipus says that's where we put it. Don't forget I said anything about Frankenstein's monster. It was a shitty allegory. My brain's back dealing with zombie shits.
Yeah, I think I think at least when they're talking about it now, when they talk about, there's something even more than the prohibition of incest, as Alyosha brought up as well. I think what we're going to start realizing is it's starting to become a much deeper genealogy, and I think it's going to start going into like guilt and debt relations with regards to anti-production and stuff like that.
All right, I think we continue. Yeah, I'll go ahead and keep reading then. This is going to be a long section. Culturalists, that's where we're at, right? Culturalists and ethnologists. I think that's where we're at. I'm going to read from there.
You're good. Yeah, that's where you are.
Culturalists and ethnologists have demonstrated that institutions are primary in relation to affects and structures. For structures are not mental, they are present in things. Not going to read that. In the forms of social production and reproduction. Even an author like Marcuse, one whom one would not suspect of complacence in this regard, acknowledges that culturalism started on the right track, introducing desire into production, strengthening the link between instinctual and economic structure, and at the same time indicating the possibility of progress beyond the patrocintive acquisitive culture. Then what caused culturalism to go wrong? And here again, there is no contradiction in the fact that it started on the right track, and that it went wrong from the start. I like that. There's no contradiction in the fact that it started on the right track and that it went wrong from the start. Perhaps the answer lies in the postulate common to Oedipal relativism and Oedipal absolutism, i.e., the stubborn maintenance of the familialist perspective, which wreaks havoc everywhere. For if the institution is first understood as a familial institution, it matters little to say that the familial complex varies with the institutions, or that Oedipus is to the contrary a nuclear constant around which families and institutions turn. The culturalists invoke other triangles, maternal uncle-at-nephew, for example. But the Oedipalists have no difficulty in demonstrating that these are imaginary variations of one and the same structural constant, different figures of one and the same symbolic triangulation, which are not identical either with the personages who come to realize the triangulation, or with the attitudes that come to place these personages in relation to each other. But inversely, the invocation of such a transcendent symbolism does not rescue the structuralist from the narrowest familial point of view. The same holds for the endless debates on, is it daddy, is it mommy? You are neglecting the mother. No, you're the one who fails to see the father off to the side as the empty position. This doesn't seem like it adds terribly much to what we were talking about, but essentially is continuing to say the same thing, talking about sort of the different ways that the breeds of psychoanalysts have taken Oedipus to mean different things inside of cultural discussions. And they're just critiquing.
I really like that quote of for institutions or structures are not mental, they are present in things. I think you could misread that as some kind of objectivist structuralist statement, but I don't think that's what they're saying. I think it just goes back to what we've talked about all along about, there being no split between a fantastical mental realm of understanding and the social production.
Because ultimately they play upon desiring production the same way on the flows. Is that essentially, that's, Holland talks a lot about this idea of social production and desire production. Essentially, when we talk about the savages, whatever we want to call them, the primitive societies, their potions and their rituals and all of those things play upon, they're just as real as anything else because they play upon the flows of everything, and everything acts directly upon each other in a material sense. So therefore, effectively, they're all just as real as each other. The conflict between culturalists and orthodox psychoanalysts has often been reduced to these evaluations of the respective roles of the mother and the father, or of the pre-Oedipal and the Oedipal, without allowing either side to lead the family or even Oedipus. Always oscillating between the famous two poles, the pre-Oedipal maternal pole of the imaginary, and the Oedipal paternal pole of the structural. Both on the same axis, both speaking the same language of a familialized social realm, where one pole designates the customary maternal dialects, while the other designates the imperative law of the language of the father. The ambiguity of what Gardner called the primary institution has been clearly shown. In certain cases, it can be a question of the way desire invests the social field from childhood, and under the familial stimuli coming from the adult. All the conditions would then be given for an adequate, extrafamilial, understanding of the libido. But more often it is solely a question of the familial organization itself, which is thought to be lived first by a child as a microcosm, then projected into the adult and social development. Michael Dufresne, analyzing the concepts of Gardner, raises these essential questions. Is it the family that is the primary? Will the political, the economic, and social are secondary? Which comes first from the viewpoint of the libido, the familial investment or the social investment? And methodologically, is it necessary to go from the child to the adult, or the adult to the child? From this point of view, the discussion can only go around in circles between the holders of a cultural interpretation and the holders of a symbolic or structural interpretation of this same organization. Again, talking back and forth over and over that of the originalists and the people who believe it's learned. And they're saying it's neither and both, I guess. I may stop halfway through.
If you want, I can give it a shot.
Please, Will. Thank God.
Yeah, sure. A second postulate common to the culturalists and the symbolists should be added. They all agree that, in our patriarchal and capitalist society at least, Oedipus is sure a thing, even if they underline, as does Fromm, the elements of a new matriarchy. They all agree that our society is the stronghold of Oedipus, the starting point for re-encountering an Oedipal structure everywhere, or on the contrary, they hold that the terms and the relations should be made to vary within non-Oedipal complexes that are no less familial on that account. That is why our preceding criticism was directed at Oedipus, as it is meant to command our respect and to function for us. It is not at the weakest point, the primitives, that Oedipus must be attacked, but at the strongest point, at the level of the strongest link, by revealing the degree of disfiguration it implies and brings to bear on desiring production, on the syntheses of the unconscious, and on libidinal investments in our cultural and social milieu. Not that Oedipus counts for nothing in our society. We have said repeatedly that Oedipus is demanded and demanded again and again. And even an attempt as profound as Lacan at shaking loose from the yoke of Oedipus has been interpreted as an unhoped for means of making it heavier still and of resurrecting it on the baby and the schizo. To be sure, it is not only legitimate but indispensable that the ethnological and the historical explanation not be in contradiction with our social organization, or that this organization contain in its own way the basic elements of the ethnological hypothesis. This is what Marx was saying when he recalled the requirements of a universal history, but, as he went on to say, provided that the current organization be capable of conducting its own criticism. And yet, Oedipus's autocritique is something rarely seen in our organization, of which psychoanalysis forms a part. In certain respects, it is correct to question all social formations starting from Oedipus, but not because Oedipus might be a truth of the unconscious that is especially visible where we are concerned. On the contrary, because it is a mystification of the unconscious that has only succeeded with us by assembling parts and wheels of its apparatus from elements of the previous social formations. It is universal in that sense. Thus, it is indeed within capitalist society that the critique of Oedipus must always resume its point of departure and find again its point of arrival. I love that section.
I love this.
I love it so much.
So let's go back a little bit, because we had discussed previously in another section why you can't fuck your mom and you can't fuck your kids inside of primitive societies. It's not Oedipal in nature, but it's simply the nature of your need for your familial relations to carry on genealogically down, or for you to be able to trade off your sisters, your daughters, things like that. There were reasons that they didn't do these things in primitive societies. And Will, correct me if I'm wrong, a lot of this final part of this paragraph is basically saying, so what we've done is we've taken these facts about how primitive societies worked, and we've said, oh, that's Oedipus. That's why it's always been there. When, of course, there are a lot of other reasons for it.
Yeah, no, it's like I see here the transvaluation. I see here attempting to allow for a space of autocritique within psychoanalysis. Like, this is that sort of, like, sometimes you have to be, like, you have to caution sort of a Nietzsche-Marx reading of this. But here, like, this is where I think it's totally safe and totally correct to do that. And yeah, I think you're absolutely right.
I think I finally kind of understand when they're talking about the universal here. This really helped me. When they're talking about it, it's universal in the sense of assembling the parts and wheels from elements of all the previous social formations. I know that's come up before, but that seemed to crystallize it for me.
No, actually, that's like one of the better. Again, when they use allegory, I think it helps everything. There's so much more that helps. But it's such a great, simple way of putting it together. I like it a lot. It is a mystification of the unconscious that has only succeeded with us by assembling the parts and wheels of its apparatus from elements of previous social formations. I mean, that's basically what they've been trying to say for this entire book. I mean, that's the kind of the point of the entire book. At some level, that Oedipus was not always there, that we've created it and we're able to assign it in retrospect. We're retconning.
Which is why I think, like, that's where Nietzsche's second essay in the genealogy comes in, right? Like, we retcon the entirety of the history of societal development within this discipline, and, like, it's insane, right? So if you look at the historical context of this book, like, sure, like there were already, like, Oedipus complex jokes floating around in the 60s, like, Freud is discredited, but then you have everybody walking around in France talking about their issues with their mother and their father, and not recognizing how this is so deeply embedded within the cultural discourse as it relates to everyone's own history. So, yeah.
All right. I'm going to continue on because I want to try to get through a couple more. We're going to go over 2 hours here. We can go a little bit over, luckily, so we're going to go a bit over. Oedipus is a limit, but limit has many different meanings, since it can be at the beginning as an inaugural event in the role of a matrix, or in the middle as a structural function ensuring the mediation of personages and the ground of their relations, or at the end as an eschatological determination. Now, we have seen that it is only in this last sense that Oedipus is a limit. There is also the case for desiring production, but in fact, this last sense itself can be understood in many different ways. In the first place, desiring production is situated at the limits of social production. The decoded flows at the limits of the codes and the territorialities. The body without organs at the limits of the socius. We shall speak of an absolute limit every time the schizo flows pass through the wall, scramble all the codes, and deterritorialize the socius. The body without organs is the deterritorialized socius, the wilderness where the decoded flows run free, the end of the world, the apocalypse. Oh, so it's the year 2020. Excellent. Secondly, however, the relative limit is no more nor less than the capitalist social formation, because the latter engineers, machine, and mobilizes flows that are effectively decoded. Oh, and that's a weird... I'm going to reread that sentence. I put the inflection incorrectly. Secondly, however, the relative limit is no more nor less than the capitalist social formation, because the latter engineers and mobilizes flows that are effectively decoded, but does so by substituting for the codes a quantifying axiomatic that is even more oppressive. With the result that capitalism, in conformity with the movement by which it counteracts its own tendency, is continually drawing near the wall, while at the same time pushing the wall further away. Schizophrenia is the absolute limit, but capitalism is the relative limit. Thirdly, there is no social formation that does not foresee or experience a foreboding of the real form in which the limit threatens to arrive, and which it wards off with all the strength it can command. Whence the obstinacy with which the formations preceding capitalism encast the merchant and the technician, preventing flows of money and flows of production from assuming an autonomy that would destroy their codes. Such is the real limit.
So I have no notes on this section, so Varun, maybe,
Varun,
possibly?
Come on, Varun.
Yeah, I mean, I think in this case, the decoded flow, I think it goes back to that seminar that I was talking about. But in terms of what's happening, I think in this regard is social customs and stuff. I think it's almost for their reading of their sort of bizarro, almost anthropology, is that these social codes and stuff are supposed to protect almost the decoded flow is the nightmare. They're supposed to protect that decoded flow from unleashing itself on the socius and flow through it, right? I don't know. I think Deleuze gives the example of the young person who gets like a new haircut that's never been seen before or something like that. But in this case, and I think it's under, and that's why he says that capitalism is almost paradoxical in the sense that it's structured under this idea of the decoded flow. We'll see that later. And in that sense that, I think you also see this in, like, I think in the Communist Manifesto, right? When they write about essentially almost capitalism's almost vampiric nature, or that sort of monstrous, almost abstract, really abstract nature that, in the sense that it's, it's destroying old traditions, blah, blah, blah. It sort of goes in and it just takes out everything with it. I think it's all there in that sense. But I think the part that sort of throws me off is that, so capitalism does sort of have the limit where it reaches a relative limit. But then they say the schizophrenic is the one who reaches the absolute limit, which sort of confuses me. It's almost like it's capitalism's like dependent on the schizo or something.
Well, so Holland talks through when he's referring back to this section and in general social production, and they mentioned it here for the first time as the axiomatization of flows. Axiomatic social organization under capitalism, by contrast, is quantitative and strictly meaningless. Nameless workers, regardless of gender, are valued only as abstractly quantified amounts of labor power on the market, and no qualitative distinction between labor and surplus labor any longer exists. Original and still fundamental capitalist axiom, as I have said, conjoins deterritorialized and quantified flows of liquid wealth, monetary wealth no longer embodied in landed property, with deterritorialized flows of free labor, workers no longer tied to specific means of production who therefore have no means to sustain life other than by sale of labor power. The eternal search for new sources of profit, capitalism continually axiomatizes other qualitatively dissimilar resource flows, transforming them into quantitatively exchangeable commodities on the market. The continual expand of capitalism is what they're referring to, is what he's referring to here. And so that limit, and I think that's what you're asking about, Varun, is the moving.
Yeah.
The limit is almost a perception-based thing. It's not that there's an actual limit at any point, but that within capitalist society versus the communal sort of original society, or even despotic, limit is something that exists within a society that they're continually sort of expunging the excess. They do so originally by, again, rituals, orgies, feasts, all kinds of stuff that keeps things, if you want to use the term in balance, maybe the best. With despotic, they actually, it's as they refer to it, it's like the worst of both worlds. You have the continual excess, but the excess is brought in very specifically to a stand-in for God, the despot, who gets everything, but the peasant is still alienated ultimately, not to use too Marxist a term. But the limit that exists within capital is continuously something that is right there, that all of us almost feel oppressively, repressively, and that moves consistently based on our ability to take those decoded flows and continually commodify them. And that's what happens within capital. And that's why that moves, because then if I've found a thing that is at that limit, but then we've commodified it and sold it, that limit moves again, and capital is able to continually increase that pretty much ongoing.
Yeah, I think it's in regards to that schizo-revolutionary that takes the decoded flow to its very limit. I think it's all almost coming down to that schizo-revolutionary in a sense.
Yes, I think so. They get into that pretty. They get into that pretty clearly, actually, really fast here too. But the idea of relative limit is no more or less than the capitalist social formation. Right before they do say, we shall speak of an absolute limit every time the schizo flows pass through the wall, scramble all the codes, and deterritorialize the socius. The idea of a schizo essentially not caring about how codes flow or what codes are. It is literally consistently the limit because it kind of encompasses all, wouldn't it?
Yeah, 1 second. I'm just trying to reply to Jack of Hearts Collins. I think at least in my understanding of the third paralogism, it is Kantian in the sense that they're asking what are the conditions for experience, but they're also giving, Deleuze, inspired by Maimon, is reading for, that desire has to engender the a prioris as well, right? So the a priori synthesis is engendered by desire itself. And that all comes from Maimon and the systems he builds up in difference and repetition and his readings of Leibniz and stuff. But with regards to that, so the conditions for all real experience comes down to the gradual process of the three syntheses unfolding. And the third synthesis is essentially where, it's almost like desire becomes conscious, but it's a misrecognition, right? It's that misrecognition that was my desire, rather than the fact that it's a whole other scenario, right? And it's also that, the subject never really comes to that almost whole recognition, because the subject's only a small part, right? They say that the subject only consummates a small energy to the entire source of production that occurs.
So I'm actually going to read the next paragraph, and I think we'll stop there and we'll have a quick discussion, because then I think the next paragraph closes out this thought before they move on to a lot more things, which we will discuss. Either we'll do more tomorrow. We'll decide at the end of this if we continue tomorrow, if we continue next week. When such societies are confronted with this real limit, repressed from within, but which returns to them from without, they regard this event with melancholy as a sign of their approaching death. For example, the Bohannans describe the TIV economy, which codes 3 kinds of flows: consumer goods, prestige goods, and women and children. When money supervenes, it can only be coded as an object of prestige, yet merchants use it to lay hold of sectors of consumer goods traditionally held by the women. All the codes vacillate. Doubtless, to begin with, money and to finish with money, in an operation that cannot be expressed in terms of a code. Seeing the trucks that leave loaded with export goods, the TIV elders deplore this situation and know what is happening, but do not know where to place their blame. A harsh reality. But fourthly, this limit, inhibited from the interior, was already projected onto the primordial beginning, a mythical matrix as the imaginary limit. How can this nightmare be imagined? The invasion of the socius by non-coded flows that move like lava? An irrepressible wave of shit, as in the Ford myth? Or the intense germinal influx, the this side of incest, as in the Urugu myth, which introduces disorder into the world by acting as the representative of desire? Whence, in the fifth and last instance, the importance of the task of displacing the limit, causing it to pass into the interior of the socius, in the middle, between a beyond of alliance and affiliative this side of, between a representation of alliance and the representation of filiation, as one attempts to tame the dreaded forces of a river by digging an artificial riverbed, or by diverting it into 1,000 shallow little streams. Oedipus is this displaced limit. Yes, Oedipus is universal, but the error lies in having believed in the following alternative. Either Oedipus is the product of the social repression, psychic repression system, in which case it is not universal, or it is universal in a position of desire. In reality, it is universal because it is the displacement of the limit that haunts all society. The displaced represented that disfigures what all societies dread absolutely as their most profound negative, namely decoded flows of desire. I don't have any final thoughts on that.
I mean, I think what this chapter highlights is the nuance of the whole thing.
Yes.
I mean, you can't just say it. And, I was also falling upon, so it's just a prohibition of incest. And, I think most people who read this is suddenly get that almost eyeball moment, like, so there is still so much more in their system that they're going to start uncovering out. It makes it a lot more rigorous of a study, but it also makes it a lot harder for us to read.
Yeah, it deals so deeply with sort of the nuance and, anytime you're talking in general about decoded flows and how we're going to even interpret them, let alone talk about them, and concepts like this, you're going to hit places of nuance and poetry, for lack of a better word, that become a thing we need to discuss and go through. And it's one of the reasons I like, as I was reading through this chapter, I'm glad we're stopping where we are, because it'll give me time to digest a lot of this. But it's just it's such a breakdown of what they were trying to say earlier and how we can regard and think about the coded flows of desire within a society and the uncoded flows. It's great. Any last thoughts? Because I think we're going to sort of wind up here. The question would be, do we I would vote we have a discussion tomorrow. We do our classic sort of review session and go over all the way up to this point. And then next week we finish the section because I think, and they're related obviously because they're part of the same section, but I think this is a very nice clear cutting point for us to sort of break this part in half and have a lot deeper discussion. If you want to go into the chat, you can. Thumbs up is going to be we do tomorrow as a review. Thumbs down is tomorrow we just read through. And that's a pretty easy setup. So tomorrow will be a review. We will go over all of these points, which is good because it'll give me a chance to take a break and edit through this. So I want to thank all of you guys for joining us. All of you so much. And thank you all for your questions and comments in the chat and for your interrogations. please join us. We need your lenses, as I always like to say. Thank you, guys. Oh, and that's where I'm going to edit everything else. Thank you, guys. Really, this was awesome. What a good section.